I'm Rabbi Patrick, and welcome to Kehillah. Time to set our opening covenant for this episode number 4. Goodness. Episode number 4. We're already there, huh? So thank you, Penn, for suggesting this one. If you want to suggest one, rabbi@kehillarva.org. That's rabbi@kehillarva.org. I know it's a different email address than what you're used to, but that's what we're doing. We're, changing things up a little bit, trying some new stuff. And speaking of shaking things up a little bit, we're going to do our opening covenant, or if you have more than one intention, our opening covenant, a little differently this time. So, typically what we do is something that's scriptural, right? And maybe calling this opening covenant is not even the right term, right? Maybe there's actually something different. But I want you to sort of gain intention from these opening readings, right? So these first things that we say, maybe you'll be able to spawn some sort of creative ideas about what you intend to get out of today's podcast episode. So this one, a little different. This is actually from the Pittsburgh platform. This is an early platform, if not the first platform, of Reform Judaism. And I'm reading for you section 1. So this is the first plank of that platform. We recognize in every religion an attempt to grasp the infinite, and in every mode, source, or book of revelation held sacred in any religious system, the consciousness of the indwelling of God in man. We hold that Judaism presents the highest conception of the God idea as taught in our holy scriptures, and developed and spiritualized by the Jewish teachers in accordance with the moral and philosophical progress of their respective ages. We maintain that Judaism preserved and defended amidst continual struggles and trials and under enforced isolation this God idea as the central religious truth for the human race. So that is the first plank of the Pittsburgh platform of Reform Judaism. So what is progressive Judaism? We call ourselves at Kehillah, we are an independent, progressive Jewish community. So this is kind of like a class. And we'll see how you feel about this, and maybe we can try more of these class type of episodes. But just the way I view it, maybe scholars would feel differently. I've never really thought of myself as a scholar. But there's a few themes. There's 4 themes as far as I consider it. So first, progressive Judaism is the umbrella term, or at least I think it's a good umbrella term, for all forms of non-Orthodox Judaism. Right? So Orthodox Judaism, even though it has different flavors based on where a community is from, the normative languages, is it Judeo-Arabic, is it Yiddish, is it whatever, is it Hebrew, right, among the Trugim, whatever the taste of it is, it's still sort of this normative Orthodox Judaism. So within us, we have a sort of normative, not Orthodox Judaism. Now, that doesn't tell you much about what progressive Judaism actually is, but it's a good umbrella term for everything, mostly everything, that is not Orthodox. And then there's actually 3 things that I think separate it. So it's a positive attitude towards change, meaning we lean into change. We actually kind of like change. We want change to happen. And this doesn't mean that we change everything. It doesn't mean we always change what we do, but we lean into it. We're not looking necessarily to protect Judaism from change. We're looking at having Judaism within the change. It's egalitarian, so it is gender inclusive. Everyone can do every role. And then finally, it's heterodox. Practice within the community is going to be different person to person. So I have friends who are Orthodox Jews. I kind of know whether they are Nusach, Ashkenaz, sort of normative Northeastern, New York, New Jersey Jews. Like, I kind of know what Shabbat's going to look like. And their Syrian Jewish neighbors who are also Orthodox, it's going to be kind of the same thing. They can be together. Maybe there's some things where they differ, right? So maybe like, do you eat rice and corn on Passover? Like, yeah, maybe there's a difference there. But like, for the most part, everyone's kind of doing the same thing, even if they like to do things their own creative way, okay? And so when you're in the shul, in an Orthodox synagogue, everyone's kind of following the rules, capital T, the rules, okay? if I go to a conservative synagogue or a Reform synagogue, everyone's doing things differently. If I go to a renewal Jewish community, I'm going to have one person who keeps kosher for ecological reasons, eco-kosher as they call it. You're going to have another person who's a vegan. You're going to have another person who, eats treif, eats, non-kosher food and doesn't think anything of it. Sort of a story. This one time, Rebbitzin was driving past a synagogue and, or no, excuse me, that's not right. She was at a synagogue. She was walking out of Shabbat service. That's what happened. So she's walking out of Minyan and she's going down these steps to come home, and she heard an older woman yell out her husband's name, and I'm going to make up a name, but basically it was like, "Morty, get the car. We're going to be late for the seafood special," meaning like, quit blabbing, quit yapping with all of your friends here. We got to get to the restaurant for the seafood special, which we know seafood special. Okay, that's shrimp and scallops and lobster. Let's be honest. But it was at a conservative synagogue, right? And so probably sitting next to that couple, maybe even talking to the husband who's dilly-dallying before they go to the restaurant. Maybe there are people who keep kosher, right? Maybe there are people who walk on Shabbat instead of driving, which this other couple were going to do. And by the way, it's not an age thing, right? So this is, let's say in this story, an older couple that's going to drive after Shabbat service to the restaurant to eat the shellfish, on Friday night. But they may be sitting next to, let's say, late 20s LGBTQ plus person wearing tzitzit, wearing fringes, and maybe that person only walks on Friday night. I mean, there's heterodoxy. Again, everybody's doing something different. The traditional take on progressive Judaism. So now that I've kind of given you these broad brushstrokes, right? Positive attitude towards change. It's egalitarian and everybody's kind of doing their own thing, even if the religion teaches one thing you're supposed to do. The traditional take on progressive Judaism, right? Like what my Orthodox friends in yeshiva are told it's about is that after sort of 1815, after Napoleon's defeat, Jews lost the rights of citizenship in several countries. We were considered a different nation, right? And our Siddur didn't help with that, right? If you read it a certain kind of way. Many Jews converted, right? And under social pressures 400 years ago, even in the Inquisition, right? You had this kind of thing. And then you had also people who were either converting out of Judaism for economic reasons, right? They couldn't operate businesses on Sunday. They also couldn't operate businesses on Shabbat. So effectively, you've created a system where you can't work. Maybe there's other reasons, like you couldn't have certain jobs, usually in the government or in publicly funded institutions like schools or universities. And so there was an idea that maybe you could have a Judaism that was going to allow people to have it both ways, right? To be in the world, but also to retain Jewish identity. And then you had this other group who said, no, we need to pull away, right? We need to do our own thing. We need to become more insular. So this is modernity. And hiding from the world works a little bit, but en masse, it doesn't work. So Rabbi Abraham Geiger, a really famous Reform rabbi, suggested that Jewish observance might be changed to appeal to modern people. So you would maintain Judaism. Nothing would change sort of about what Judaism fundamentally was, but maybe certain elements of it would. Certain ways of doing Jewish might change so that you could have it both ways and you wouldn't have to have sort of an insular society. This is not new. Judaism changes over time, and it always changes to impact human life in some kind of positive way. I don't know of a religion that over the years has become harder to practice. Maybe there are, but I don't know of them. So we'll take like the original Shabbat. It was actually very austere. It involved the Levites, the priests, and ritual slaughter. But for the everyday Joe, it was really just being in a cold tent, right? There's no fire. There's no Shabbat candles. Right, it was kind of brutal. The rabbis, who are sort of like the heirs, let's say, to the religious authority, institute sort of these different ideas, these different ways of doing the Sabbath, which allowed people in a very limited way to opt out of certain religious practices. It's called Heder Parnasa. But then also just a general change, right? Making Shabbat something that's warm and inviting as opposed to something that's a little bit more cold and austere and brutal. All right, and that's just one example of how Judaism changed over time. Of course, there's countless others. So, going past like hundreds of years, we get to 1885 and the Pittsburgh Platform, the thing that I just read one plank from. So you have these rabbis, and they were all, Orthodox Jews at one point, right? And they say Judaism needs to change, right? We need it so that to change so that we can be in this world, right, living our lives, but also retain our Jewish identity. We're not going to be like our more traditional friends. And so this idea of a Judaism that is reform comes about, and it takes 100+ years for all of this to formulate until you get to 1885. But skipping ahead, we get there, and you have these rabbis who assemble in Pittsburgh. And, it's interesting because a lot of the areas where these early rabbis did this work are places now that we don't think of as Jewish places. I mean, not to the degree that we do now, right? So like Ohio, Pennsylvania, right? Like the Rust Belt. Yeah, it's important history to remember. Cincinnati, that was a big one. So in any case, they come up with this Pittsburgh Platform. And so they developed two of these ideas that I think really get to the point of what Reform Judaism was, at least in the early days. So here we go. So we recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. Now remember, Israel doesn't exist, and so they're using this term Palestine. And today we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies, or we might call like ritual ideas, to elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such that are not adopted to the views and habits of modern civilization. Okay, so they're making a sort of Bible-first approach to Judaism. This is not unlike our friends, the Karaites, but that's like a whole other ballgame. And they go on to say, we hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws that regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. I love this idea, present mental and spiritual state. You have to understand that these early Reform rabbis really thought Judaism was on the brink of destruction, and that what it meant to be a modern person, Judaism just did not touch the hearts and souls of people. And they go with this line, they failed to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation. So the sort of theory was, if we make people wear yarmulkes and wear tali-tote prayer shawls and wear tzitziot while, walking around little fringes, flapping around and sort of looking Jewish and eating Jewish and, having social customs Jewishly, that people are going to opt out. And better to have people opt into something that they like than opt out of something they don't, because ultimately the goal is the elevation of the human soul and morality, at least as far as they're concerned. So we have this change into Reform Judaism that frankly looks very Protestant. If you were to go to a classical Reform service, there's going to be a lot of English, be very little Hebrew. Some of the rituals have been changed. Certainly ritual objects like prayer shawls and yarmulkes, you're not going to see those. So that is like the original progressive Judaism, right? Very different than what would come about. So conservative Judaism or Masorti Judaism sees halacha, sees Jewish law as being normative and binding, and that it must be practiced. So Sabbath, dietary laws, purity, all of that. But they're willing to do it through the lens of academic criticism, maintaining the laws, but they're always subject to considerable evolution. So you don't sort of stop doing the activities, right? You don't stop doing the rituals. You just investigate them and you tweak them, right? So whereas reformed, we might say that conservative Judaism is interested in iteration, right? Small changes over time that reflect human need, but that doesn't mean you're going to change the liturgy a whole bunch. It doesn't mean you're going to change behavior a whole bunch. We might say that conservative Judaism was born the day that they allowed people to drive on Shabbat, but with lots of rules around it. You have to get in the car, go to the synagogue, needs to be the nearest conservative synagogue to you. You have to do the service and then leave and go home, right? You can't stop along the way to get ice cream or whatever. All right, so you try to conserve, literally that's their name, conserve the mitzvot as best as you can in light of circumstances. So Reconstructionist Judaism comes out of that milieu. And it says that tradition tells us that Torah was dictated by God to Moses and then transmitted to generations. So this is the premise of why rabbis even have any kind of spiritual power, is that this Mizorah, this tradition, has been carried down, and then someone handed it to us and said, okay, you figure it out. It's this very metaphysical thing, made physical in this world. So Reconstructionism sees this differently. It sees the Torah as the Jewish people's response to God's presence in the world. So instead of sort of Torah being given to us, law being given to us metaphysically, we created the Torah in light of the knowledge of the divine. Okay, so the Torah is like our particular way of doing a very universal thing. What would this mean? So like God does not choose the Jews to be performers of commandments. Rather, the Jews choose to be called by God by, and I'm going to use Rabbi Lester Bronstein's line here, called by God by means of a vast network of sacred acts ranging from balancing work and rest, Shabbat, to establishing courts and laws, medical ethics, and the rhythm of the seasons. And then he goes on, and this is sort of an idea that comes from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Paradoxically, it is the mitzvot that keep us Jewish, but which simultaneously attune us to the greater universe of which we are a tiny part. Okay? So we do these very particular things, which we have developed by human imagination and consciousness, but in response to the divine. Okay? And the more we do these things, paradoxically, the more Jewish we become. And oddly enough, the more particular we are, the more of this particular thingness of Judaism we do, the more we actually connect to the universal. So, in other words, we can have cafeteria religion where, we read like this cool book by, whatever the latest pop culture guru person is. And then we also take a meditation in a class, and then we take a Hindu yoga class, but then we also go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, right? But we also have a Christmas tree. Like, we can be those people. I'm not here to judge that. You know how many photos of little kids lighting menorahs have Christmas trees in the background? Like, welcome to modern life, okay? But the more sort of Jewish we are, instead of kind of cafeteria religion where we pick all the things we like that taste good, the more particular we are, actually the more connected to those universal things we are. So instead of, for lack of a better word, Christmas tree and Hanukkah, we have just Hanukkah. But there is something about having just that Hanukkah that opens our spiritual consciousness to the idea that in darkness we create light. And that's why we have a Hanukkah, we have a menorah. That's why our Christian friends have a Christmas tree, right, which came from something else. It's why, our Hindu friends have lanterns on Diwali, right? So that's the idea. We actually attune more to something that is greater, the more particular we are. There's another idea, Jewish Renewal. So this is still under the umbrella. It's a movement that combines a heavy emphasis on spiritual practices, particularly those from Hasidic Judaism. So I think of it as like Reconstructionist Hasidism. So you take socially progressive values, the egalitarianism that I mentioned earlier, the leaning into modernity. There's a lot of environmental awareness, sort of Gaia consciousness type stuff. But within Jewish mysticism, within Hasidic thought, and it's recast in these very progressive type terms. So I used like eco-kosher as an example. Some people say the Jewish renewal is like Hasidism with New Age. I actually don't think that's really fair. Yes, it comes out of that era, right? Reb Zalman Schachter Shlomi, of blessed memory. He was part of that, dawn of Aquarius era. But it continued on, and it continued on because it was deeply into mysticism and Hasidism. This is going to be a little different than Reconstructionist Judaism, which is going to be a lot more on the, I think we might call it the pro-intellectual side. Okay, so whereas I think Jewish Renewal and Reconstructionism actually have a lot in common, and there's a lot of people who are kind of in both lanes, I would say that Reconstructionism is using the brain and Jewish Renewal is using the heart. So you need both. Modern Reform Judaism, so, less than 100 years later, is going to be a different ballgame. There's this sort of phrase here I want to read from you. This is from the Platform of Reform Judaism in 1976. This is about 90 years later. The past century has taught us that the claims made upon us may begin with our ethical obligations, but they extend to many other aspects of Jewish living, including creating a Jewish home centered on family devotion, lifelong study, private prayer, and public worship, daily religious observance, keeping the Sabbath and the holy days, celebrating major events of life, involvement with the synagogues and community, and other activities which promote the survival of the Jewish people and enhance its existence. Within each area of Jewish observance, Reformed Jews are called upon to confront the claims of Jewish tradition, however differently perceived, and to exercise their, and this is the key phrase, individual autonomy, choosing and creating on a basis of commitment and knowledge. So modern Reform Judaism actually asks a little bit more, we might say ritually, of the Jewish people than classical Reform. Having said that, it is a lot less prescriptive. So whereas in classical Reform Judaism, you would have, let's say, a rejection of wearing certain kinds of clothing. Here in modern Reform Judaism, you're going to have the idea that, well, actually, it can't just be the ethical stuff with occasional Shabbat observance, right? Actually, these things that make the Jewish people unique are things that we need. Now, we're not going to force you to do any of it. We're not going to put ourselves in an orthodox sort of place. We are going to lean into modernity, right? But we're also going to have the sort of heterodox stuff. That's the other thing we're going to do. We're all going to kind of do things differently based on our own individual autonomy. Now, this is, of course, great thinking. However, we have this issue of heterodoxy again, right? Like if I can pick whatever I want from the menu of Judaism, the person sitting next to me on my right and my left, they may think differently, and that may impact how we live together. But this idea of individual autonomy creates more of that heterodoxy that I was talking about earlier, and it leans into egalitarianism, and the idea of women being rabbis and all of these other things that came about once we moved past sort of that classical Reform Judaism. There are some communities that still practice classical Reform, but we're much more in this modern Reform era. Out of this comes Humanistic Judaism. It views all of this very differently. It sees Jewish culture in the context in which our humanism finds its fullest and most natural expression. So in other words, Judaism is the culture. Judaism is to the Jewish people what Hellenism was to the Greeks, is kind of a metaphor. It's language, history, food, humor, literature, holidays, life cycles. Okay, that's Jewish culture. But ultimately, what we need is secular humanism. But the secular humanism can be flavored by those traditions, customs, memories that are meaningful to you, and that it is easier to be a humanist if you have that cultural stuff to work with, right? So in the sort of suitcase of what makes you a human being, you have the traditions, ideas, ideals, and you use whatever is in there, ultimately understanding that we live in an amoral universe without divine intervention of some kind, and that it's up to us to live fully as human beings with whatever sort of stuff we have. And they go on to say, we embrace Judaism because we cherish its traditions, music, language, literature, etc., etc. Our culture adds richness to our lives and connects us to our families, our ancestors, and our fellow Jews. So to be a humanist, right, you don't believe in anything what we might call metaphysical, but you believe in people, right? You believe in humanity, but you can't just be kind of a robot, right? Like you have your own culture, history, language, stuff that makes you who you are. And so in order to be a humanist, you go fully into your humanity as opposed to going into things like liturgy, spirituality. And out of that, you become the best humanist you can be by virtue of the culture that you come from and what it has to give you. So how does this make any sense? Well, if you think about the fact that 27% of Jewish adults consider themselves atheist, agnostic, or of no particular religion, well, that certainly makes sense. Also a third of Jews born after 1980 think of their Judaism as a matter of identity and ancestry. That's how you wind up with that. Okay. Now, people will say, oh my gosh, that means we need to completely change Judaism. But that's only a third of people, right? That means that like 2/3 of people care about Avinu Malkeinu. 2/3 of people care about, let's say, observation of Yom Kippur, right? 2/3 of people, whether they keep kosher or not, are engaged with that on some spiritual level. And I think that this is an incredible idea, right? There's this tendency, I think, to make everything parev, to make everything neutral in Jewish sort of external community life so that everyone can kind of feel comfortable. I think actually leaning into God is a better idea. Maybe, people could criticize that. But people are hungry. People want spirituality. They want meaning. And that's hard to do by just having, cultural events. Certainly we need them. Don't get me wrong. I'm a person who believes that what we call the mitzvot, what we call the commandments, or maybe even better would be to use the term mazora, the tradition, actually deeply matters on a cultural level. And I would say it's very holy, right? If what you want to do is make grandma's matzo ball soup recipe or great grandma's kunefe recipe, right? Those things I think are spiritual and can be elevated to something like prayer. I mean, I think that there are other rabbis, even within more traditional Judaism, who would agree. So now that you kind of know what progressive Judaism is, the question is, how is Kehillah that? And why do we use this term progressive? Well, we're independent, and we don't belong to Reform, Conservative, certainly Orthodox Judaism. I'm not Jewish Renewal. I converted to Judaism through a Reconstructionist community and lens, and I still, in a lot of ways, see myself in that vein. That's where I like to drive. But I'm not that, right? I didn't go to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Seminary. So we want to embrace everybody. And the thing is, if you look at, now I said, there was a certain percentage of people who were Jewish but didn't necessarily believe in anything metaphysical. The fastest growing movement in Judaism, if you want to have another good statistic, is independent. It means none of the above. It means I'm doing my own thing, right? I'm just Jewish. Yeah. That's growing. And I think part of progressive Judaism is not just sort of heterodoxy, and egalitarian and all that. It's the positive attitude towards change. So if people think of themselves as non-denominational, if they think of themselves as Jewish if they think of themselves as deeply caring about social issues and wanting to do social action through a Jewish lens, we absolutely need to embrace that. And having that identity of, none of the above, so to speak, progressive, we're not Orthodox, you get what you get. But saying that we're independent just like you, I think that matters a lot. I think that it is meaningful to a lot of people to sort of declare their Jewish independence. And that's part of what we're here to do. So thank you so much for listening to this. We've got lots of different classes and social events and Shabbat coming up. You need to go on our website, kehillarva.org. Check out all of that, and we'd love to see you. And remember, you matter.